All right, so this presentation, once it loads, is about captains of industry. And we're going to talk today about three men who are very well known for different things in industry. Before we start, we're going to watch a little clip of a video that kind of summarizes them all up. Here we go.
In the oil business, there was chaos, and I brought order. It was done the way it was because that's the way it had to be done. No one complained when I brought light into every home. No one complained when I provided thousands of jobs. Oil is what this country runs on. You call it monopoly. I call it enterprise.
This is the future. Nothing's impossible. We're in the early days of a new industry.
Ladies and gentlemen, the electric light.
You want a cartel between oil and railroads. Here's to new alliance.
Indeed.
Congratulations, Carnegie. You're now the richest man in the world.
How many more companies will go bust, Mr. Morgan?
No, we're on the verge of depression.
Not if we act wisely.
The war's not over. It's only just beginning. We're gonna watch them bleed.
I'm giving you one more chance to call off this strike.
Mr. Carnegie, get out of my damn way!
All right, so first thing we're going to talk about is what is a monopoly, because this is going to come in handy later. So monopoly is when only one company controls a product or service. For example, let's say you have a town, you have all sorts of little restaurants in that town that people could go eat. You could have McDonald's come to town, all of a sudden they're able to offer things much, much cheaper than the other restaurants and pulls all the other restaurants out of business. So let's talk about how these men ran monopolies. The first man we're going to talk about is Cornelius Vanderbilt. Here's a couple quotes from Cornelius Vanderbilt that kind of tell a little bit about what kind of person he is. First one is, I don't care half so much about making money as I do about making my point and coming out ahead. And then, you have undertaken to cheat me. I won't sue you, for the law is too slow. I'll ruin you. Vanderbilt was born in New York and grew up poor. He began his first business as the owner of a ferry boat, and he was able to turn that ferry boat into a fleet of ships. During the Civil War, he sees the building of the Transcontinental Railroad, and he realizes that trains will undoubtedly be the next big thing. So he decides he's going to sell all of his ships, and he's going to put all his money into railroads. And he tries to buy every single railroad in America. But some of them are like, my railroad's not for sale, and they won't sell it. So Vanderbilt is ruthless and shuts down the Albany Bridge, which is the bridge, the only bridge into New York. New York being a huge, super important city for trade. And he shuts it down because he owns it. And so guess what? They have to sell, because if their railroad doesn't go into New York, nobody's going to want to ride their railroad anymore. They're going to want to ride Vanderbilt's railroad that goes into New York. Let me show you a movie clip about that.
For years, Vanderbilt groomed George to take over the family business. Now, the Commodore is forced to rely on his less accomplished son, William.
I'm making you operations director of the Hudson Railroad.
Vanderbilt places William in the midst of negotiations with the owners of a rival railroad.
So name your price.
If you give us your freight year-round, we will give you the privilege of allowing your passengers access into Manhattan for $200,000.
That privilege is not worth $200,000.
settle on 100,000? I believe that to be a fair and generous offer.
I'm not really interested in your generosity. I'm only interested in getting the best deal for my shareholders. And that does not include handing over $100,000 or even $1.
My father wants only what he believes is right.
The trouble is, your father doesn't know what is right. The old man should be put out to pasture.
The message is clear. The competition no longer sees Vanderbilt as a man to fear.
People are always rooting for very successful people to fail. The day people are not taking shots at you, it means you're not on top anymore.
But where they see weakness, the Commodore sees an opportunity to assert his dominance and teach William what it means to be a Vanderbilt.
If they want a war, I'll give them a war.
Vanderbilt owns the only rail bridge into New York City. It's the gateway to the country's largest port, supplying the entire continent. Vanderbilt knows this is the hammer he needs to beat his rivals into submission.
Sit down. I want you to close the Albany Bridge.
Without the bridge, every other railroad is shut out of New York City.
Vanderbilt, in essence, single-handedly erected a blockade around the nation's largest city, cutting it off from contact with the rest of the country. He was now asserting his dominance.
Ladies and gentlemen, this train will not be going any farther.
We're gonna watch them bleed.
Shutting the bridge leaves millions of pounds of cargo unable to reach the rest of the country and slowly bleeds his competitors dry.
Don't worry about it.
Before their stock is worthless, the presidents of the rival railroad try to sell all their shares. Word quickly reaches Wall Street, triggering a massive sell-off.
New York Central shares are dropping fast.
How low?
$20 a share.
Buy everything you can.
Too comfortable. Just for one.
Vanderbilt was buying all of that stock that suddenly flooded the market at rock bottom prices.
Three aces.
In just days, Vanderbilt Vanderbilt takes control of the rival railroad, creating the largest single rail company in America.
Wow. Boom. Vanderbilt consolidated his railroad monopoly before oil and steel come into power in this country. He wanted to own all of the railroads, but Thomas Scott of the Pennsylvania line would not sell. He decided to become more powerful, he would need a resource to move by train that no one else could move. So he settled on oil and kerosene because it was the new hot thing. It was really selling big around the country. He knew that most oil found underground was in Ohio, and he also needed an oil refinery that was close to his railroads. So he found one that was owned by a man named Rockefeller. And so he calls up Rockefeller for a meeting. And Rockefeller, he ends up missing the train that day. And you know what? It turns out that the train he was supposed to catch crashes off a bridge, and everyone dies. So, good thing for Rockefeller, right? He takes another train, and he makes a deal with Vanderbilt to only move his oil on trains run by Vanderbilt. So by the end of the war, he's the richest man in America, worth over $68 million, which is $75 billion today. And he even helps to build a Grand Central Station in New York. He ends up dying at age 82, and he gave very little of his money away to charity, which wasn't a surprise. He really was not a major philanthropist. When he died, he ended up leaving all of his money to his son. So here's a little video summing up his life. All right, so let's reiterate. Vanderbilt made all of his money in railroads. Vanderbilt railroads. Moving on, John D. Rockefeller. He was the world's first billionaire. So Rockefeller was born in New York in 1839. His father's a traveling salesman, and he grows up poor. In 1855, Rockefeller drops out of high school, and he enters a professional school. Rockefeller gets his first job as a bookkeeper in 1855, and he would celebrate this day for the rest of his life, the first day that he truly got into the working world. In 1863, Rockefeller and several partners entered the booming new oil industry by investing in a Cleveland refinery that will eventually become an oil monopoly. When Vanderbilt asks to meet with Rockefeller, he is not confident. But remember, he missed his train. And so after he misses his train, he thinks, man, God must have spared my life for a reason. So he goes into the meeting with Vanderbilt with a lot more confidence. And he makes a deal to only transport his oil on Vanderbilt trains for a low price. Talked about that, right? So after he makes his deal with Vanderbilt, he started producing more oil than Vanderbilt could even transport. So, all right, well, what are we going to do now? So he makes a deal with Thomas A. Scott, who was another railroader, and he makes this deal to start allowing him to move his oil. But this deal was even lower than what he was paying Vanderbilt. Vanderbilt was super angry. So Vanderbilt made a deal with Thomas A. Scott to go in together, and they make Rockefeller pay more to both of them to transport his oil. And now Rockefeller's like, what? So he's angry. So he paid, but only until he began building an underground pipeline to carry his oil without using the railroads at all. Checkmate. Vanderbilt dies in the middle of all this, so Rockefeller goes to Thomas A. Scott and demands that he reduce the amount he was having to pay out of Pennsylvania. Scott refuses because Rockefeller has no pipeline in Pennsylvania yet. So Rockefeller retaliates with closing down the Pennsylvania refinery, even though it cost him millions. This causes Scott to lose so much money that he has to lay off most of his workers. Thomas A. Scott's laid-off workers become so angry that they burn down his buildings and destroy hundreds of rail cars, and this leaves Scott out of business. However, Scott's right-hand man is about to come up with an idea to bring Rockefeller down. Again, let's reiterate, Rockefeller made all of his money in oil. Now, last man we have to talk about is Andrew Carnegie. Some people say Carnegie, but same man, different spell, different way to say it. Life in Scotland had been difficult for Andrew's family. His father, William, toiled endless hours over a hand loom in their little cottage. You see that hand loom right there? He spent hours at it. But guess what? Then they came up with a new invention called power looms during the Industrial Revolution, and that put cottage weavers like William out of work. And rather than face a life of poverty, being poor, Margaret insisted the family emigrate to the United States, where her two sisters had already lived. So the Carnegies arrived in 1848, and they settled near Pittsburgh. Carnegie was hired by Thomas Scott when he was just a boy of 12 years old. He grew up being mentored by Scott, and Scott had taken Carnegie under his wing, taught him the business, helped him start his own business. And Scott knew that the man who figured out how to build a bridge across the Mississippi would be a rich man indeed. So Carnegie starts his first company called the Keystone Bridge Company, and he knew that iron would not work to build these bridges, and he would need to use steel. But unfortunately, the problem was the whole process of making iron into steel at the time was super expensive, and so he needed to figure out how to make that much cheaper. So in 1872, he hears about this new process being used in Britain, and he goes to Britain, and this whole process was created by a man named Henry Bessemer, and it greatly reduced the cost of making steel. And upon his return, Carnegie announces, "The day of iron has passed, steel is king." So this bridge that he is building across the river costs way, way more than he anticipated, even with this new format. He ends up being in horrible debt, and it's 2 years past when it should have been completed, so a little bit late. So he has to find more money, and so he goes to investors and they give him more money, and he's able to complete it after 4 years. So the problem is that everyone is afraid that the bridge would fall. It was a crazy long bridge. It was built out of steel, which was a fairly new thing at the time. So, how is this going to work? So he convinces the public by walking an elephant, as you see in the picture, across to prove its strength. Then we would be able to use it for other things. So there's basically this popular notion that elephants instinctively will not cross an unsteady structure. So they figure, hey, if the elephant, he walks across, we'll be good. It's a gamble, but you know what? It works. So when this succeeds, he gets even more requests for his steel. Railroads want to replace their bridges and rails with steel. The bridges that they had at the time were not doing well. They were falling apart, and so they desperately needed to replace them. And they saw how strong steel was with this bridge that he created. And so now they want to replace them all with steel, along with the rails. Unfortunately, they want more steel than he can produce. So he needs to raise more funds so he can make more steel. He turns to Tom Scott, his buddy, for more money to build his first steel plant, and Scott helps him out. And he makes this plan in Pittsburgh. And again, we talked about this before. This is why Pittsburgh is known, their football team is known as the Steelers, because this is where steel was being produced. So now that Scott is dead and Carnegie has lost his mentor, the man that meant more to him than anyone in the world. He believed Rockefeller drove Scott to his grave, and he wanted revenge and had the money from his steel monopoly to try and get it. Remember, he thought Rockefeller was to blame because remember what Rockefeller did to Scott. He basically pretty much ran him out of business. So what Carnegie sees is that he can make a ton of money building skyscrapers out of steel because cities are filling up with immigrants and they need more room, and well, they don't have any more room to build out, so why not build up? So modern America will be built using Carnegie steel. Carnegie tries and fails to become richer than Rockefeller. They kind of had this little competition going between them. Carnegie ends up selling his business to J.P. Morgan in 1901 for $480 million. And the sale of his company made Carnegie one of the richest people in the world with a fortune of $500 million. And he already knew what he was going to do with it. He was going to give it all away. Carnegie and Rockefeller were both major philanthropists, giving a lot of their money to various charities. And that's why today you see a lot of things named after them in the areas where they lived, because they gave away so much money. He gave 7,689 organs to churches. He built more than 1,900 libraries for towns throughout the United States and supported colleges. When he died at the age of 83, he had nearly spent all of that $500 million on doing things in his community. So again, let's reiterate that Carnegie made all of his money in steel. So here we have a little sum up here. So Vanderbilt, railroad, Rockefeller, oil, Carnegie, steel. Now, there is a new guy in town who wants to break up these monopolies that these men here on the bottom created. And he's going to do that by running for president. And his name is William Jennings Bryan. And he sees these rich men as robbers, and he thinks they should all be in jail. This causes a lot of concern for Morgan, Rockefeller, and Carnegie. They don't want to go to jail. So they all get together, and they come up with a candidate to run against Bryan. They choose a guy by the name of William McKinley. They give him a ton of money, and because of that, he is able to win the election. So here's the issue. 6 months into his second term, he is shot and killed. And this leaves his vice president as the new president of the United States. Anybody know who his vice president was? Well, you know what? I'm going to tell you. His vice president was a man named Theodore Roosevelt, also known as Teddy, also known as a trustbuster, a breaker of the monopolies. So it is time to say goodbye to the Industrial Revolutionary era and say hello to the Progressive era. Get ready to meet Teddy Roosevelt, who will be making a guest appearance real soon. Just watch out for his big stick.